Scrooge states several times, "What has Christmas ever done for him?" He gets visibly irritated by people being merry and cheery at Christmas. Oh, and don't say Merry Christmas to him. He definitely does not like that. Why do you suppose he feels this way? What could possibly have happened to somebody to make them feel such discontent for a saying and for Christmas joy in general? The first two staves of A Christmas Carol can help us answer these questions. So who is Scrooge? Well, he's a penny pincher. He's a sinner. He is extremely mean. He's hard-hearted, and he's a loner. Physically, he has old features. He has a pointed nose, sunken cheeks. He has a stiffened gait. He has red eyes, thin blue lips, and a wiry chin. The narrator tells us, external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. No one talked to him in the street, not even to ask for the time. Okay, so that's Scrooge. He doesn't like people, and he especially doesn't like Christmas. The Ghost of Christmas Past shows him things from his past that makes him think of some people we meet in Stave 1. So let's talk about them a little. The first person we meet is Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's employee. What do we learn about Cratchit? Well, we learn that Scrooge is taking advantage of Cratchit by paying him a measly 15 shillings a week. Bob Cratchit can't afford a winter coat, so he uses a blanket. He uses it in the office, and he wraps himself in it when he's walking from work to home and home to work. It doesn't help that Scrooge won't let Cratchit have enough coal to heat his office either. Cratchit is clearly scared of Scrooge. Scrooge has threatened to fire him several times, including on Christmas Eve. Scrooge also tried to make him feel guilty for taking off for Christmas and made him promise that he would come in even earlier the next day. The next person we meet is Scrooge's nephew, Fred. He stops by the office to invite his uncle to dinner. Fred dares to say Merry Christmas to his uncle. Scrooge retorts with that famous saying, "Bah, humbug." Scrooge asks his nephew, why is he so happy considering how poor he is? To which his nephew asks, why is his uncle so unhappy considering how rich he is? Scrooge refuses to come over, and one of his excuses is that Fred got married. Marriage for Scrooge is as absurd as Christmas. Scrooge really doesn't understand why people are happy at Christmas, considering it's just a time to remind them of how poor they are. He also says that Christmas hasn't done him any good. When it's clear Scrooge won't agree to dinner, Fred left, but he didn't let Scrooge's attitude get him down. When he left, he let two gentlemen into the office. Now, the events of Christmas Past don't directly address this interaction, but I thought we could look at it since it ties to what Jacob Marley tells Scrooge when Marley comes to visit Scrooge. It also gives us a little insight into Victorian England at the time. These men come to ask Scrooge to donate to help the poor, to help give them food and to help keep them warm at Christmas time. This distressed Scrooge because he was worried, did this mean the government assistance for the poor had gone away? Yes, during the Victorian era they had, quote, government assistance, end quote, for the poor. This was services that were supposed to help people who couldn't take care of themselves financially, with things like workhouses, treadmills, not the kind you're thinking of, and even prison. When Scrooge asked why people just don't go to these places, one of the men said that some people would rather die than go to one of these places, to which Scrooge retorted that these people should just hurry up and die to reduce the surplus population. Eventually, Scrooge tells them he doesn't get involved in other people's business. He is busy with his own business to bother with others. The final person we meet in Stave 1 is a boy who is out in the bitter cold, with fog so thick you can hardly see in front of you. The boy attempts to sing Scrooge a carol, but Scrooge ran him off with the threat of violence. Before we get to the Ghost of Christmas Past, we should understand why the ghost comes to Scrooge in the first place. Jacob Marley visits Scrooge at Marley's old home where Scrooge now lives. We already know from Stave 1 that Marley and Scrooge were a lot alike. When Marley appeared to Scrooge, he looked like he did in life, except that he has this chain laden with cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel that are wrapped around his waist. Oh, and he's also a little see-through. Why does Marley have this weird chain? Well, he tells Scrooge that he built this chain, link by link, when he was alive. In this story, it turns out that if you spend your life not caring about your fellow man, and you don't use your money or your time to help people in need, or you don't just enjoy the little things in life, then when you pass, you go to some sort of purgatory-like place where you're forced to drag around the things you cared most about in life. In Marley's case, it would be his money and his business. In addition, Marley never traveled beyond his town, so now he's forced to travel nonstop around the world. He never gets to rest. This sounds like the worst kind of afterlife. Somehow, Marley gets permission to show himself to Scrooge and to warn Scrooge that this is his fate if he doesn't change. And to help him change his ways, there will be 3 ghosts that visit him, one each night for the next 3 nights. Scrooge asks, why can't he just get them all at one time? But Marley doesn't respond to that. And eventually Marley says he's leaving and they're never going to see each other again. All right, so now we can finally talk about the ghost of Christmas past. The ghost looked like a child, but also looked like a man. He had a face with no wrinkles, but he had long hair that was white from age. But his skin looked wrinkle-free like a young child. He had these weird, long, slender, and muscular arms and hands, but these delicate, formed legs and feet. The ghost held a branch of fresh green holly and wore a white tunic trimmed with summer flowers with a sparkling and glittering belt around the waist. And there was a bright, clear light around his head. The ghost's vision fluctuated, so some parts of it were visible at times and other parts were visible at other times. The purpose of this weird image of this ghost is to sort of compare it to Scrooge. The light and the smooth skin and wrinkle-free skin is supposed to remind us of childhood and nature. But then there's this unnatural, weird part about it with the arms and unnatural musculature. Ultimately, it's supposed to give us this feeling that the past is distant from him and how different it is from how Scrooge is today. The first place the spirit takes him is to the school that he basically grew up in. They get to the town and they walk the road to the school where they encounter some people that he knew back then. He's really surprised to find that he is happy when he sees them, and he's not annoyed when he hears them say Merry Christmas to each other. He didn't understand how he could feel this way, considering, Christmas never did any good for him. So already we're starting to see him find those memories of his childhood, memories that he's lost or repressed because they weren't bad memories. Then they get to this dilapidated mansion that is supposed to be this boarding school where young Scrooge was residing. They see him sitting alone by a barely flickering fire, reading a book. He was all alone, and he was very lonely. This is one of the many Christmases where his family left him at the school at Christmas time. I don't know if this is something that was done back then, but it's also notable that none of the other kids invited him to come stay with them at Christmas, because it was very clear he was being left there alone. To counter the loneliness that he feels, he immerses himself in the books that he reads, like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves and Robinson Crusoe. He imagines himself in those stories, and he imagines the creatures, or the people, coming to life and being around him. Scrooge gets excited because he can see these images in young Scrooge's mind of Robinson Crusoe and Ali Baba. But he also can feel the heavy loneliness of this boy, and Scrooge sits there next to the boy and weeps. Then his mind goes to the young boy who tried to sing him a Christmas carol earlier in the story. And now he's allowing his feelings to connect to this boy, and he wishes that he had actually given the boy money rather than running him off. Next, the ghost takes him to a Christmas several years into the future. But they stay in the school, and the school sort of decays around them from the years of neglect, until they get to a day when Scrooge's little sister comes to take him home for good. No more being left there, no loneliness, no being alone. He was coming home and he was going to be with her. And she tells him that their dad has softened, that he's not as, she doesn't use this word, but abusive as he once was. His sister is much, much younger than him, but she's really happy for him to come home. She pulled him from his room and they left in the carriage. As they drove off, the ghost and Scrooge talk about how kind little Fan was. But they also talk about how she died when she was young. Not too young, because she was able to have a child, Scrooge's nephew Fred. Fan was important to Scrooge because she represented innocence and childhood and the things that he's lost because he's been forced to live in this boarding school. But by coming home with her, he can regain some of that. And when she passes away, he loses that and that connection he had with her. And this is probably why he doesn't like to spend much time with Fred, because Fred probably reminds him of his sister and what he's lost, and he just doesn't want to deal with it. Next, they come to a Christmas when Scrooge was an apprentice for Mr. Fezziwig. That night, Mr. Fezziwig and his wife threw a party for their employees and families to celebrate Christmas. Scrooge and the other apprentice, Dick Wilkins, gleefully clear the work area for everyone to have the party. The many people enjoyed good food and good music. The Fezziwigs danced all night. When it was over, the Fezziwigs stood on either side of the doorway and shook everybody's hands that night and wished each one of them a Merry Christmas. Scrooge and Dick lived in the shop, and after everyone left, they talked about how wonderful Fezziwig was. The ghost commented about how Fezziwig spent only a small amount of money to create such happiness. Scrooge explained that it wasn't the money that made the difference, but how Fezziwig treated the employees and treated the people around him. He said it was how Fezziwig talked to them and how he made their work pleasant. He could have easily made their work feel like toil, but he didn't do that. Then Scrooge's mind starts making the connection, and he thought about Cratchit and kind of wished that he could say something to Cratchit at this moment. Then the ghost takes Scrooge to a time when he was a little older, but still in the prime of his life. This time he was sitting with his fiancée, Belle. This was not a happy time because she tells Scrooge that she believes he loves money more than he loves her, and she doesn't really like how he's changing. She's decided to break up with him, and she hopes this hurts him just a little, though she isn't sure it will at all. Now they jump to just before Jacob Marley's death, so this is a little over 7 years in the past. The ghost and Scrooge look on his former fiancée, Belle, and now she's married and she has a bunch of kids. She's playing with her daughter and the other kids, and they're all having fun and laughing and climbing all over her, doing things that Scrooge wasn't allowed to do when he was a little kid. Then her husband comes home. You can imagine the feelings this brings up for Scrooge. The two are deeply in love, and they really love their kids, and they really enjoy the chaos that the kids bring. Once the kids go to bed, the husband tells Belle that he saw her old friend that day, and she guessed it was Scrooge. He told her he happened to be walking by Scrooge's office. The shades were up so he could see Scrooge through the window, and Scrooge was sitting there all alone. This is all just too much for Scrooge to bear. He sees what his life could have been like. He sees what life is like for other people. He sees what he's lost and the choices that he's made in his life that's gotten him where he is. Lonely, alone, childless, wifeless, and friendless. And he can't stand this anymore, and he begs the ghost to end the torture. But the ghost doesn't really relent. So Scrooge grabs the ghost's cap and presses down on it until the ghost is all but pushed into the floor. Then Scrooge is home and asleep in his bed, exhausted by what's happened. What we see from Scrooge's past is that he was very lonely as a child. He was not treated well by his family. There was probably some abuse, and he really didn't have many friends. As a young man, we start to see the decisions that he makes that brings him to what he eventually becomes. He starts obsessing over money because he was poor and he doesn't want to feel that way anymore. He allows himself to lose his fiancée over his obsession for money. His little sister, who is one of the most important people in his life, she dies and he loses that connection that he had. Now, knowing all of this about his life, we can kind of see why he is so distrusting, why he chooses to be alone, why money is so important to him, and why he has such a bad attitude about Christmas and marriage. The Ghost of Christmas Past and what he saw does start to change him a little. He starts seeing things a little bit differently than he did before, but that's not enough to make him become the person he needs to become. And that's why we also get the Ghost of Christmas Present and the Ghost of Christmas Future. By the time he has all of these experiences, the Scrooge that we know at the beginning of the story is not the Scrooge we see at the end of the story. And this is important because we need to see where he came from to see how he got where he is. We also need to be able to see where he is, to see where he goes, to see the huge transformation, to see the possibilities of such a transformation.